The silence in the small clapboard church was a physical thing, a heavy blanket woven from judgment and fear. It pressed down on Martha's shoulders, a weight far heavier than the simple wool of her shawl. Outside, the Dakota sun beat down on the parched earth, but inside, the air was cold, chilled by the stony faces of the town council. At their center stood Preacher Thompson, a man whose piety was as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. His voice, when it came, was not a shepherd's call but a judge's gavel. "Martha," he began, letting her name hang in the air like an accusation, "it has been 6 months since your husband passed into the Lord's hands. 6 months in which this community has suffered a blight on its corn and a sickness in its cattle." The women whisper. "They say you read books of earth and stone, that you speak of things a woman ought not to know. They say your mind is unseemly." He paused, letting the poison seep into the room. Martha sat perfectly still on the hard pew, her hands folded in her lap. Beside her, pressed against her leg, Kaiser, her German shepherd, let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. She placed a calming hand on his thick fur, her touch the only thing betraying the tremor that ran through her. She had known this was coming. Her husband, a kind and simple man, had celebrated her curiosity. He'd marveled at the way she could predict the weather by watching the clouds, the way she understood which plants could soothe a fever and which could poison a well. But without his gentle presence as a buffer, her knowledge had become a threat. In a world of rigid faith and harsh survival, her quiet competence was seen not as a gift, but as a perversion of the natural order. The preacher's eyes, small and dark, fixed on her. "This council has decided. Your presence here is a disruption to the harmony of our flock. We cannot have you sowing seeds of doubt and unnatural inquiry. You will leave. The land your husband worked is forfeit to the church, for the good of the community. You may take what you can carry on your own back." Be gone by sunrise. There was no debate, no appeal. It was a verdict. The faces of the men and women she had known her whole life were closed to her, their expressions a mixture of relief and self-righteous pity. They were casting her out to save themselves from a phantom they had created in their own minds. Martha rose, her back ramrod straight. She did not look at them. She looked at the cross hanging on the wall, a simple wooden thing meant to represent mercy. She found none here. She turned, her worn leather boots making no sound on the dusty floor, and walked out into the blinding sunlight, Kaiser a loyal shadow at her heel. They threw her out not for a crime she had committed, but for the potential of the mind she possessed. The exodus began in the deep, starless dark before dawn. There was no ceremony to her departure, only the quiet, methodical work of a woman who had already accepted her fate and was now moving on to the next practical problem. Martha moved through the small cabin she had shared with her husband, a ghost in her own home. She took no heirlooms, no sentimental trinkets that would weigh her down with memory. Survival was about the future, not the past. Into a sturdy canvas pack went a whetstone, a small cast-iron skillet, a precious tin of salt, a flint and steel, and her husband's sharpest skinning knife. She wrapped 3 loaves of dense rye bread and a slab of cured pork in oilcloth. The most important items went into a sealed leather pouch, a small collection of seeds she had painstakingly saved over the years. Not just beans and corn, but hardy greens, resilient root vegetables, and herbs her mother had taught her were worth more than gold. Lastly, she tucked a slim, worn book into the pack, a text on geology and soil composition her father had given her long ago. It was the source of her unnatural inquiry, the very thing that had condemned her. As she worked, Kaiser watched her with intelligent, anxious eyes, his tail giving a low, uncertain thump against the floorboards. He knew this was not a routine chore. He whined softly, a question in the sound. "It's all right, boy," she whispered, her voice rough. It's just us now. She didn't look back at the town, a collection of sleeping shadows huddled against the vast, unforgiving prairie. There was nothing for her there but the ashes of a life that was no longer hers. She walked north, towards the broken lands, the Badlands, a place the settlers avoided, believing it to be cursed and barren. Her husband had once acquired a small, forgotten parcel there to settle a debt, a piece of land so worthless no one had ever bothered to officially reclaim it. He'd called it the scar, a deep, ugly ravine that offered no flat ground for planting, no easy access to water. For a farmer, it was a dead end. For Martha, a woman with nothing left to lose, it was a destination. She moved with a steady, ground-eating pace, Kaiser trotting silently beside her, his presence a warm and reassuring weight in the terrifying emptiness of the plains. Each step was a deliberate act of defiance, a quiet refusal to be broken by the verdict of lesser minds. The sun rose behind her, casting her long shadow ahead, pointing the way toward an unknown future. After 3 days of hard travel, she found it. The land was exactly as her husband had described, perhaps even more desolate. It wasn't a gentle valley but a sharp, deep gash in the earth, as if a giant had dragged a blade across the prairie. The sides were steep, a jumble of rock and dry, crumbling soil. The floor of the ravine was narrow, choked with stubborn, thorny brush. To the east and west, the flat plains stretched into an infinite, windswept horizon. Any sensible person would have seen this place as a tomb, a final, hopeless destination. But Martha was not any sensible person. She stood at the edge, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face, and she didn't see a wasteland. She saw topography. She saw angles. She saw potential. Kaiser, sensing her shift in mood from weary travel to intense focus, sat at her feet, his gaze following hers. She spent the entire day just observing, walking the rim of the ravine, then carefully making her way down its treacherous slope. She noted how the north-facing wall was in shadow for most of the day, its soil cooler and darker. But the south-facing wall, that was different. It was a perfect, sun-drenched slope, angled almost as if by design to catch every ray of light from dawn until dusk. She crumbled the soil in her hands. It was rocky, yes, but beneath the surface layer of dust, it was a rich, loamy clay. Good for holding water, good for holding heat. She remembered a passage from her father's book, a chapter on thermal mass. The earth, it explained, is a massive reservoir of stable temperature. Just a few feet below the surface, the brutal swings of summer heat and winter frost vanish, replaced by a constant, cool stillness. The wind could howl at 20 below zero on the surface, but 4 feet down, the ground would remain just above freezing. An idea, wild and audacious, began to take root in her mind. It was a concept so contrary to the conventional wisdom of the settlers, who built their wooden boxes on top of the land, exposed to its every fury. Why fight the environment when you could partner with it? Why build up into the wind and sun when you could build down, into the earth's embrace? This ravine was not a flaw. It was a feature. The steep, south-facing slope wasn't an obstacle to be overcome, it was a foundation waiting to be used. In that moment, standing in the bottom of that forsaken gash in the world, surrounded by what others called worthless, Martha felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, but the exhilarating thrill of a complex problem and the dawning certainty that she, and she alone, possessed the key to its solution. The work that followed was brutal, a relentless assault of body against earth. There was no grand design at first, only the raw, immediate need for shelter. Martha chose a spot midway up the south-facing slope where a slight overhang of rock offered a natural starting point. Her only tools were the knife from her pack and a flat, sharp-edged stone she found in the ravine floor. Day after day, she clawed at the dirt and clay, her hands quickly blistering, then callousing into tough, hardened leather. She used the skillet to scoop and carry away the loosened earth, dumping it further down the slope. Kaiser, unable to dig with her, took on the role of sentinel. He would lie at the entrance of her growing hollow, a silent, watchful guardian, his ears swiveling to catch the slightest sound, his occasional low growl a warning against the coyotes that yipped in the distance at dusk. The first goal was simply a cave, a space deep enough to shield them from the relentless wind and the coming cold. Each inch of progress was a monumental victory. She learned the language of the earth she was moving, the soft give of topsoil, the stubborn resistance of clay, the grating scrape of stone against stone. She discovered a small, steady seep of water trickling from a rock fissure near the base of the ravine, a lifeline that saved her from having to journey for miles. She purified it by boiling it in her skillet over a small, carefully concealed fire. Food was a constant, gnawing concern. The bread and pork were gone within the first week. She set snares for rabbits and squirrels, her placements guided by an instinct for animal trails and habits. Her successes were infrequent at first, but each catch was a precious infusion of strength. She foraged for edible roots and bitter greens, her knowledge a shield against starvation. There were days of crushing despair, when her muscles screamed in protest and the sheer scale of the task seemed insurmountable. She would sit at the mouth of her shallow burrow, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, and a profound loneliness would wash over her. It was in these moments that Kaiser's presence was most vital. He would push his great head under her hand, his warm, solid body a reminder that she was not entirely alone in this vast, empty world. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the hollow deepened. It was not a home, not yet. It was a den, a primal shelter carved from the planet itself, a testament to the stubborn, unyielding will of a single woman who refused to disappear. With a basic shelter secured, Martha's focus shifted from mere survival to the grander vision. The den was a refuge, but the ravine held the promise of something more, a place not just to endure, but to cultivate. She began to methodically expand her excavation, not just digging deeper, but wider, following the sun-drenched contour of the slope. Her father's book, read by the flickering light of her small fire, was no longer a source of comfort but a practical manual. It spoke of passive solar design, of how an angled surface perpendicular to the winter sun's low arc could capture a surprising amount of energy. It described the insulating properties of Earth, how a foot of soil could possess the same thermal resistance as many inches of wood. Her plan was no longer just a vague idea, it was becoming a precise, mental blueprint. She envisioned a long, narrow structure dug horizontally into the hillside. The back and side walls would be the earth itself, a perfect, natural insulator. The floor would be dug down 4 feet below the entrance, creating a pit where the coldest air would settle, leaving the upper levels warmer. The front wall, facing due south, would be the key. It needed to be transparent, a window to the sun. The roof would be angled steeply, covered with a thick layer of sod and clay, leaving only the south-facing front exposed. This design, she reasoned, would create a massive heat trap. Sunlight would pour in through the southern face, warming the dense earthen walls and floor during the day. At night, as the outside temperature plummeted, that stored heat would slowly radiate back into the space, keeping it from freezing. It was a greenhouse, but inverted, subterranean. A pit house designed not for people, but for plants. The physical labor was staggering. She used a sturdy branch as a lever to pry out larger rocks, her body learning the simple physics of force and fulcrum. She mixed the excavated clay with dry grass and water, forming a crude but effective plaster to stabilize the interior walls and prevent collapse. She was an architect, an engineer, and a laborer all in one, her mind constantly solving the hundreds of small problems that arose each day. How to brace a section of loose soil. How to divert a trickle of groundwater. How to create tiered levels inside for planting beds. She worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about feeding herself. It was a magnificent experiment, a proof of concept. She was building a testament to the very knowledge that had gotten her cast out, turning their accusation of unnatural thinking into a tool for creating life in the most barren of places. The breakthrough came one sweltering afternoon while she was digging near the eastern end of her excavation. Her makeshift spade struck something that didn't thud like rock or yield like clay. It made a sharp, splitting sound. Curious, she cleared away the soil and found a thin, vertical seam of a strange, layered stone. It was dark gray, almost black, and when she worked a piece of it free, she found it was composed of countless paper-thin layers. It was shale. With careful work using her knife, she discovered she could split the rock along these layers, creating flat, semi-translucent sheets. They were not clear like glass, not by a long shot. They were murky, streaked with mineral deposits, and let through a diffused, milky light. But they let light through. This discovery changed everything. Glass was an impossible luxury, something that would require a journey to a major town and money she did not have. But this shale, this rock glass as she began to call it, was here. It was part of the land itself. She could mine her own windows. She spent the next 2 weeks painstakingly quarrying the fragile sheets, learning the exact pressure needed to split them without shattering them. It was delicate, frustrating work, but she slowly amassed a small, precious stack of the panes. It was around this time that she realized she was being watched. Kaiser had been on edge for days, his low growls more frequent, his posture alert as he stared out from the ravine. Then, one morning, she saw him, a figure on the opposite rim, silhouetted against the rising sun. A man, standing perfectly still, just looking. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. Was it someone from the town? Had they come to drag her back, or worse? She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man didn't move for a long time. He wasn't armed, at least not with a rifle she could see. He was just observing. Finally, he raised a hand, not in a threat, but in a slow, deliberate wave, then turned and walked away. The visits continued for a week. Every morning, the silent figure would appear, watch for a time, and then leave. He never came closer. The initial fear gave way to a wary curiosity. This was not the behavior of a posse. This was something else. One day, instead of leaving, the man began the slow, careful descent into the ravine. Martha stood straight, her hand resting on Kaiser's head to keep him from charging. She held her sharpest digging stone in her other hand, her knuckles white. He was an old man, weathered and lean, with a face like a dried riverbed and eyes that had seen more winters than she could count. He stopped a respectful distance away, his gaze taking in the massive excavation, the neat pile of shale panes, the sheer evidence of her impossible labor. He was Abel, a trapper and trader who worked the lonely fringes of the territory, a man who valued competence above all else. He had heard the whispers at a distant outpost of a madwoman digging her own grave in the Badlands. What he saw before him was not madness. It was the most brilliantly sane thing he had ever seen. He broke the silence first, his voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. "What in God's name are you building, woman?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a question born of pure, unadulterated awe. Martha's grip on the stone tightened. Trust was a currency she no longer possessed. Kaiser stood rigid beside her, a silent, menacing promise of violence should the man step closer. "A root cellar," she said, her voice tight. It was a lie, but a plausible one. Abel squinted, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He looked at the pile of translucent shale, at the precise angle of the excavation facing the southern sky. "That's a peculiar sort of root cellar," he said, his tone dry. "Most folks ain't so particular about their potatoes getting to the morning sun." He took a half step forward, and Kaiser's growl deepened into a chesty rumble. Abel stopped, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "Easy now. I'm not here for trouble. My name is Abel. I trade in these parts. Heard stories. Had to see for myself." Martha remained silent, her mind racing. This man was an unknown variable. He could be a threat, a thief, or worse, a link back to the world that had rejected her. But there was something in his eyes, not pity, but a frank, professional respect. He was looking at her work, not at her. He saw the engineering, not the outcast. "It's a greenhouse," she said finally, the admission feeling like a risk. "An underground one. To use the earth's heat to grow things in winter." Abel's eyebrows shot up. He was quiet for a long moment, processing the audacity of the concept. He walked the length of the excavation, staying a safe distance away, his eyes scanning every detail. He saw the logic in it, the brutal, simple elegance of her design. "Well, he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It might just work." He turned back to her. "You've done all this with just your hands and a skillet." "And a knife," she corrected him, her tone still wary. He shook his head slowly. "You need tools. A proper spade. A pickaxe. And that rock glass of yours is clever, but real glass would be better. I've got some panes I salvaged from an old mission." He paused, his gaze direct. "I'll make you a trade. My tools, my glass, and a sack of the best seeds you've ever seen. For a share." A share of whatever you manage to pull out of this hole in the ground when the snow flies. It was an offer of partnership, an alliance founded not on sentiment, but on a shared understanding of the harsh realities of their world. For Martha, it was a lifeline. For Abel, it was the smartest investment he had ever made. A third, she countered, her voice firm. And you tell no one what you see here. He broke into a wide, cracked grin. A quarter, he shot back, and you have my word. No one will hear it from me. She considered it for a moment, then gave a single, sharp nod. Done. The arrival of Abel's tools transformed the nature of the work. The heavy, sharp-edged pickaxe bit into the earth with a satisfying crunch, doing in an hour what would have taken Martha a day of scraping. The broad steel spade moved soil with an efficiency that felt like a miracle. Her progress exploded. The raw hole in the ground began to take on the clean, deliberate lines of her mental blueprint. Together, they worked, their partnership settling into a comfortable, mostly silent rhythm. Abel, with his trapper's knowledge of timber and leverage, helped her scavenge sturdy, deadfall branches from a distant copse of trees, showing her how to notch them to create a strong, interlocking frame for the roof. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke of a deep, practical intelligence. He never questioned her design, only offered suggestions on how to execute it more strongly, more durably. The day he brought the glass was a turning point. The panes were small and irregular, salvaged from old church windows, but they were clear. They handled them with the reverence of priests handling holy relics. Fitting them into the wooden frame was the most delicate part of the entire construction. They used a mixture of clay and pine pitch. Abel prepared to seal the edges, creating a surprisingly airtight wall of light. The roof was laid with the scavenged timbers, then covered with a thick layer of oilcloth Abel had traded for, and finally, heaped with a foot of the excavated soil and planted with prairie grass. From the outside, when it was finished, it looked like nothing more than a gentle, grassy hummock on the side of the ravine. Only the angled wall of glass, glinting in the sun, betrayed the secret it held. Inside, it was a different world. The space was long and narrow, perhaps 30 feet by 8, with the floor sunk deep into the earth. Martha had built tiered earthen beds along the back wall, maximizing the planting area. A simple but clever ventilation shaft, a narrow tunnel dug up to the surface far behind the structure, allowed for air circulation. As they put the finishing touches on it, a sense of profound accomplishment settled over them. It was more than a shelter, more than a garden. It was a machine for living, powered by the sun and the earth. Martha ran her calloused hand over the smooth, cool clay of the interior wall. She had carved this space from nothing, transforming a place of exile into a sanctuary of her own design. Abel stood at the entrance, looking back at the town he had just visited, a grim set to his jaw. "They're worried," he said. "The air's got that feel to it. The old ones are saying it's gonna be a hard winter." The first snows of the season arrived in late October, a light, delicate dusting that melted by noon. But inside the greenhouse, the change was immediate and profound. Martha had already planted her seeds weeks before: kale, spinach, hardy lettuces, and rows of carrots, turnips, and radishes in the deep earthen beds. While the prairie outside was succumbing to the creeping frost, her subterranean garden was a riot of vibrant green. The principle worked even better than she had dared to hope. During the day, the temperature inside would climb to a pleasant warmth, the soil and clay walls drinking in the solar energy. At night, as the air outside dropped below freezing, the interior of the greenhouse would cool slowly, but it never dipped below 40 degrees. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth was a perfect, silent furnace. Abel would visit every week or so, his skepticism long since replaced by a kind of quiet reverence. He would bring supplies, flour, coffee, cured meats, and simply stand for a while in the warm, humid, green-smelling air, a stark contrast to the increasingly bleak and frozen landscape. He'd shake his head and mutter, "Never would have believed it then." In mid-November, the great blizzard struck. It did not arrive with the gentle warning of previous snows. It descended like a hammer blow, a solid wall of white that blotted out the sun and screamed across the plains. The temperature plummeted to unimaginable lows. For 3 weeks, the world disappeared. Martha and Kaiser were safe in their small den, connected to the greenhouse by a short, covered tunnel she had dug as a final precaution. They had warmth, shelter, and a source of fresh, living food. The storm raged, but within their earthen bubble, they were secure. When the blizzard finally broke, the landscape was unrecognizable. Everything was buried under a thick, impenetrable crust of snow and ice. The sun shone on a world of blinding white, but it was a cold, merciless light that offered no warmth. A week later, Abel appeared, his face gaunt and grey. He had made the journey from the town on snowshoes, a grueling, dangerous trek. "It's bad, Martha," he said, his voice hoarse as he warmed his hands inside the greenhouse. "Worse than anyone has ever seen. The storm, it flash froze everything. The crops in the fields are gone. Root cellars were too shallow, everything in them is frozen solid. Their food stores are ruined. They're already slaughtering their breeding stock to eat. By midwinter, they will be starving." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a terrible gravity, and then his gaze fell upon the rows of thriving green vegetables. In the heart of a frozen, dead world, she had created an oasis of life. Martha felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't pity, not at first. It was a distant, hollow echo of the judgment she had received in that cold church. They had cast her out, declared her anathema, and now their own lack of foresight, their stubborn refusal to look beyond their narrow traditions, had brought them to the brink of ruin. For a moment, she felt a grim satisfaction. Let them starve. Let them reap the harvest of their own ignorance. But then she looked at the vibrant green leaves of the kale, plant she had nurtured from tiny seeds. She thought of the children in the town who had no part in the council's verdict. She looked at Abel's worried face, a man who had shown her kindness and respect when no one else would. The bitterness began to fade, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. Her knowledge was not a weapon for revenge, it was a tool for life. To hoard it now would make her no better than them. "We'll pack what we can," she said, her voice steady. They worked through the day, harvesting the hardiest greens and the largest of the root vegetables. They filled 2 large canvas sacks Abel had brought. It wasn't a feast, but it was fresh food, rich with vitamins, a miracle in this frozen wasteland. They did not go to the town square. They did not announce their charity. Under the cover of darkness, they crept to the edge of the settlement. Like ghosts, they moved from house to house, leaving a small bundle of carrots, a few turnips, and a generous portion of greens on the doorstep of each family they knew was struggling. They left nothing at the preacher's house. It was a quiet act of provision, not of forgiveness. The next day, the town was buzzing. The appearance of fresh vegetables in the middle of a frozen hell was inexplicable, seen by some as a divine sign. But the wiser ones knew there was only one person who possessed such unnatural knowledge. A few days later, a small delegation, led by a humbled and visibly thinner preacher Thompson, made the arduous journey to her ravine. They did not come with demands or accusations. They stood at the edge, their faces etched with desperation and shame. Preacher Thompson cleared his throat. "Martha," he called out, his voice stripped of its usual booming authority. We were wrong. We are in need. We ask for your help." Martha emerged from her dwelling, Kaiser at her side. She looked at their faces, the faces of the people who had thrown her out. She felt no triumph, only a deep, resonant weariness. She had already proven them wrong, not with words, but with the simple, undeniable fact of a green leaf in the dead of winter. Her salvation had not come from their acceptance, but from her own ingenuity. She would help them, not because they deserved it, but because it was the right thing to do. She would trade her surplus for things she needed, blankets, lamp oil, tools for another, larger greenhouse. This was not about charity anymore. It was about building a new world, on her own terms. Years later, the ravine was no longer a scar, but a lifeline. Several more pit greenhouses terraced the slope, their glass fronts gleaming in the winter sun. The knowledge she had guarded became a shared resource, a new kind of agriculture that allowed the community to thrive in a land that had once nearly destroyed them. They learned that the greatest strength is not found in rigid adherence to the old ways, but in the courage to look at the world differently, to dig beneath the surface for answers. And you, what hidden advantage lies in the thing you have been told is a flaw? What potential is buried in the places others have deemed worthless? The answers are there, waiting not for a miracle, but for the turn of a spade. If stories of resilience and ingenuity are what you seek, consider returning to this place. There are always more seeds to plant.